High in the rugged mountains south of the Caspian Sea, on a narrow ridge of rock more than 6,500 feet above the valleys of Persia, there once stood a fortress that seemed almost untouchable by the world below. For more than a century and a half, the fortress of Alamut, known as the Eagle's Nest, watched over the surrounding lands like a silent guardian of secrets. Kings feared it. Generals spoke of it with caution, and travelers passing through the region often whispered its name as if the mountains themselves were listening. But Alamut was more than a fortress. It was the heart of one of the most mysterious and controversial movements in medieval history. From within its stone walls emerged a network of devoted operatives who would change the politics of the Middle East without commanding vast armies or conquering cities. Their power came from precision, patience, and a chilling reputation. When rulers across the Islamic world heard that the assassins had marked them as a target, sleep became difficult. Armor was worn beneath robes. Guards doubled their watch. Because the men of Alamut did not fight battles in the traditional sense. They appeared without warning, struck with deadly accuracy, and vanished into history. For nearly 2 centuries, this strategy worked. Empires rose and fell, but Alamut endured, protected by its impossible geography and by the fear it inspired in its enemies. No army had ever truly broken it. Then, in the 13th century, a force began moving westward that did not fear shadows, daggers, or whispered threats. Across Asia, entire kingdoms had already collapsed before it. Cities had been erased. Civilizations shaken to their core. This was the Mongol Empire, the most relentless war machine the medieval world had ever seen. When the Mongols finally turned their attention toward the mountain stronghold of Alamut, they were not simply attacking a fortress. They were confronting a legend. And what followed would mark the beginning of the end for one of history's most enigmatic states, and prove that even the most feared powers can fall when a greater storm arrives. To understand how the fortress of Alamut became one of the most feared centers of power in the medieval world, we must step back nearly 2 centuries before its fall, into the complex and restless landscape of 11th century Persia. At that time, the region was dominated by the Seljuk Turks, a powerful Sunni Muslim empire that stretched across much of the Middle East. Their rule brought political stability in some areas, but it also created deep religious and cultural tensions. Among the many communities living under Seljuk authority were the Nizari Ismailis, a branch of Shia Islam that the ruling establishment viewed with suspicion and hostility. They were a minority without a homeland, scattered across cities and villages, often facing persecution and political exclusion. In such an environment, survival required more than faith, it required strategy. And in the middle of this turbulent world emerged a man whose intellect and determination would shape the destiny of his followers for generations. His name was Hassan I Sabah. Hassan was not a conventional military leader. He was a scholar, a theologian, and by all accounts a man of remarkable discipline and focus. Born in Persia around the mid-11th century, he devoted his early life to study, mathematics, philosophy, theology, and astronomy. But his ambitions went far beyond scholarship. During his travels, he became deeply committed to the Ismaili cause and eventually journeyed to Egypt, where the powerful Fatimid Caliphate served as the intellectual and spiritual center of Ismaili thought. When Hassan returned to Persia, he carried with him a vision that was both radical and pragmatic. He understood that his community could never defeat the Seljuk Empire in open warfare. The Seljuks commanded vast armies and controlled major cities. Any direct rebellion would be crushed quickly. But Hassan believed that power did not always come from numbers. Sometimes it came from patience, intelligence, and the careful use of fear. What he needed was a secure base, somewhere remote, defensible, and difficult to attack. After years of searching, he found it in the rugged mountains south of the Caspian Sea, a nearly impregnable fortress perched on a narrow ridge more than 6,500 feet above the surrounding valleys. The fortress was known as Alamut Castle. Capturing it, however, would require more than brute force. Hassan had no army capable of storming its walls. Instead, he relied on the method that would define much of his career: quiet infiltration. Disguised as a teacher and preacher, he slowly entered the surrounding region and began converting the local population to the Ismaili cause. Over time, he extended his influence into the fortress itself, winning over members of the garrison one by one. The process was gradual, patient, and almost invisible. Then, in the year 1090, the balance of loyalty inside the fortress quietly shifted. When the moment arrived, the governor of Alamut suddenly realized that the majority of his own guards now answered to someone else. Without a battle, without a siege, the fortress passed into Hassan's control. From that moment forward, Alamut became the heart of a new kind of state. Unlike traditional kingdoms, it did not rely on large armies or sprawling territory. Instead, it operated through a network of mountain fortresses spread across Persia and Syria. These strongholds were connected not just by roads, but by loyalty and shared belief. At their centers stood Hassan himself, who would remain inside Alamut for the rest of his life, directing operations with extraordinary discipline. Inside the fortress, life was surprisingly sophisticated. Alamut was not merely a military outpost, it was also an intellectual center. Scholars studied astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. Engineers developed systems of water storage and agriculture that allowed the fortress to survive long sieges. Libraries preserved manuscripts and scientific works from across the Islamic world. But beyond its walls, the reputation of Alamut grew for a very different reason. Hassan developed a strategy that was as effective as it was terrifying. Instead of confronting powerful rulers with armies, he trained a small number of highly disciplined agents known as fedayeen. These men were not ordinary soldiers. They were specialists in infiltration, patience, and absolute loyalty. A fedayeen might spend months, or even years, living quietly in a city, adopting a false identity and gaining the trust of those around him. He could work as a servant, a merchant, or even a guard inside a royal court. Then, when the moment was right, he would strike with sudden precision, eliminating a political or military figure whose death could shift the balance of power. These assassinations were rarely random acts of violence. They were calculated demonstrations of reach. A powerful governor killed in a crowded marketplace or a military commander struck down inside his own palace sent a clear message. The influence of Alamut could reach anyone, anywhere. Over time, the psychological impact became enormous. Leaders across the Middle East began wearing concealed armor beneath their robes. Bodyguards became a constant presence. Rumors spread that agents of Alamut were everywhere, watching, listening, waiting. Fear itself had become a weapon. And for more than a century, it worked remarkably well. The network built by Hassan I Sabah survived the rise and fall of rival dynasties. Armies marched through Persia, but few dared attempt a direct assault on the eagle's nest. The state of Alamut had proven that intelligence, discipline, and strategic terror could sustain power even against far larger enemies. But history rarely allows any strategy to last forever. Because in the 13th century, a new power began to sweep across Asia, an empire that had already crushed kingdoms far greater than Alamut. And unlike the rulers of Persia, this new force did not fear assassins. For nearly 2 centuries, the mountain fortress of Alamut had survived by mastering something far more powerful than sheer military strength: fear. Its leaders understood that a carefully placed dagger could sometimes achieve what armies could not. Rulers across the Middle East had learned to live with that reality. Some made uneasy peace with the assassins. Others simply hoped they would never become a target. But in the 13th century, a new force began to reshape the map of the world, one that did not negotiate with shadows and did not fear silent knives in the night. That force was the Mongol Empire. The rise of the Mongols was unlike anything the medieval world had seen before. Beginning in the early 1200s under the leadership of Genghis Khan, a confederation of nomadic tribes from the vast Eurasian steppe transformed itself into the most formidable military power on Earth. Within a single generation, Mongol armies swept across Asia with astonishing speed. Northern China fell. Central Asia collapsed. Entire kingdoms that had stood for centuries vanished in a matter of months. The Mongol method of war was brutally efficient. Their cavalry moved with unmatched mobility, covering distances that traditional armies could barely imagine. Their intelligence networks gathered detailed information about enemy territories long before the first arrows were fired. And perhaps most importantly, they understood the psychological dimension of warfare. Cities that resisted were often destroyed so completely that their fate became a warning to everyone else. As a result, many rulers surrendered before a single battle was fought. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Eastern Europe. It was not simply a kingdom or a regional power. It was a continental system of authority that linked distant cultures under a single imperial command. At the center of that system stood the Great Khan. In the 1250s, that title belonged to Monk Khan, one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan. Monk inherited an empire already vast beyond comprehension, but he understood that consolidation was just as important as expansion. To secure the western territories of the empire, several obstacles had to be removed. Among them were two powerful symbols of resistance in the Islamic world: the Nizari Ismaili strongholds centered around Alamut and the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. From the Mongol perspective, the assassins represented something deeply problematic. Their strategy of targeted killings had already claimed the lives of numerous political and military leaders across the region. Even the Mongols themselves were not immune. There had been attempts on the lives of Mongol officials, and the idea of a network capable of reaching into royal courts was unacceptable to a regime built on absolute authority. In Monk's eyes, the solution was simple. The entire system had to be dismantled. To carry out that task, he appointed one of the most capable commanders in the imperial family, his younger brother, Hulagu Khan. Hulagu was not only a skilled military leader but also a strategist who understood the scale of the mission ahead of him. His campaign would not merely target a single fortress. It would reshape the political order of the Middle East. The army he assembled reflected that ambition. Historians estimate that Hulagu marched west with a force that may have exceeded 100,000 soldiers, an extraordinary number by medieval standards. But what made this army especially formidable was not just its size. It was the diversity of expertise within it. The Mongol Empire had spent decades absorbing the military knowledge of the civilizations it conquered, and Hulagu's campaign would make full use of that accumulated experience. Among the most important specialists in his army were siege engineers from northern China and Central Asia. These men had perfected the art of attacking fortified cities and mountain strongholds, something traditional steppe armies had once struggled with. They brought with them advanced technology for the time: massive trebuchets, powerful crossbows capable of launching incendiary projectiles, and sophisticated methods for coordinating long-term sieges. In earlier centuries, defenders of Alamut had relied heavily on the fortress's natural advantages. The narrow mountain paths, the steep cliffs, and the isolation of the terrain had made direct assaults almost impossible. Armies that attempted to approach could easily be cut off from supplies or pushed back by defenders who knew the terrain intimately. But the Mongols had already faced and defeated fortresses across China, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Their engineers understood how to overcome obstacles that had once seemed insurmountable. For them, the challenge was not whether a fortress could be taken, but how long it would take. As Hulagu's forces moved steadily toward Persia, the news spread quickly across the region. Entire cities had already fallen to Mongol armies in previous campaigns. The destruction of Khwarezmian cities earlier in the century had become legendary for its scale and brutality. Survivors carried stories of massacres, burned libraries, and landscapes turned into silent ruins. The message was unmistakable: resistance could be catastrophic. For the leadership of the Ismaili state centered at Alamut, the situation grew increasingly dire. Their strategy had always depended on influencing politics from the shadows. But now they faced an enemy that commanded overwhelming resources and showed little interest in negotiation. A dagger could eliminate a king. It could remove a general. But it could not stop an army of tens of thousands marching across continents with the full weight of an empire behind it. And as Hulagu's army approached the mountains of Persia, the leaders of Alamut began to realize something that would have been almost unthinkable in earlier generations. For the first time since Hassan I Sabah had captured the fortress in 1090, the Eagle's Nest was facing an enemy that might truly be able to destroy it. By the middle of the 13th century, the state built by the followers of Hassan I Sabah was no longer the confident and disciplined network it had once been. For generations, the fortress of Alamut Castle had stood as the unshakable center of a system that blended faith, intelligence, and calculated violence. But like many organizations that survive long enough, its greatest threat was no longer outside its walls. It was the slow erosion of stability within them. At the moment when the Mongol storm approached Persia, the leadership of the Nizari Ismaili state had fallen into uncertain hands. The imam who inherited authority during this crisis was Rukn al-Din Kursha, a young leader who had neither the reputation nor the experience of the formidable figures who had preceded him. He was barely out of adolescence when he suddenly found himself responsible for guiding an entire network of fortresses against the most powerful military machine the world had ever known. Kursha faced an almost impossible strategic dilemma. The assassins had always relied on patience, diplomacy, and targeted intimidation. But none of those methods seemed capable of stopping the massive army marching west under the command of Hulagu Khan. The Mongols were not local rulers who could be pressured through fear. They were conquerors who had already destroyed empires far larger than the Ismaili state. As Hulagu advanced into Persia, the Mongol strategy unfolded with methodical precision. Instead of attacking Alamut directly at first, the Mongols began dismantling the wider network of Ismaili fortresses that supported it. Strongholds scattered across the mountains of eastern Persia were surrounded, isolated, and systematically reduced one by one. Some attempted to resist. Others tried to negotiate, but the pattern rarely changed. The Mongols arrived. Supplies were cut off. Siege engines were assembled. Eventually, the walls broke, or the defenders surrendered. For Kursha, each lost fortress tightened the pressure. Without the outer ring of strongholds, Alamut itself would become increasingly vulnerable. Yet even as the Mongol army moved closer, the young imam still hoped that negotiation might save his state from total destruction. Envoys were sent to Hulagu's camp. Messages of submission were delivered. Kursha even began dismantling portions of his own fortifications to demonstrate goodwill, hoping the Mongol commander might accept symbolic surrender instead of absolute conquest. But Hulagu had little patience for partial solutions. From the Mongol perspective, the Ismaili system represented a long-standing threat that could not simply be managed. It had to be eliminated. The idea that a network of assassins might continue operating anywhere within Mongol territory was unacceptable. So the campaign continued. In late 1256, the focus shifted toward one of the most important Ismaili strongholds still under Kursha's control, the fortress of Meymandiz. This mountain citadel served as the imam's current residence and a key defensive point within the Alamut system. When Hulagu's forces surrounded the fortress, the defenders quickly realized they were facing a very different kind of siege than anything in the past. The Mongol army brought with it a powerful advantage: advanced siege technology developed during decades of warfare across Asia. Chinese and Central Asian engineers working for the Mongols began assembling massive trebuchets and powerful crossbows capable of launching incendiary projectiles deep into the fortress. From nearby mountain ridges, stones and flaming missiles began raining down on Meymandiz. Walls designed to repel ladders and battering rams were never meant to withstand long-range bombardment from elevated positions. Fires spread through the interior structures. Defensive towers cracked under repeated impacts. For the defenders inside the fortress, the psychological pressure was as devastating as the physical damage. Every day the bombardment continued, the reality became clearer: the Mongols were not going to leave. After several days of intense assault, Kursha recognized that resistance would likely end in complete destruction. Unlike earlier generations of Ismaili leaders who had relied on defiance and secrecy, he chose a different path. In November of 1256, the imam walked out of the gates of Meymandiz and presented himself before Hulagu Khan. The Mongol commander received him with formal courtesy. Hulagu understood that a captured leader could be more useful alive than dead. If Kersha ordered the remaining Ismaili garrisons to surrender, the entire system might collapse without the need for prolonged sieges. And that is exactly what Hulagu demanded. Under Mongol supervision, Kersha began traveling from fortress to fortress, instructing the garrisons to lay down their arms. Many complied. In the Ismaili tradition, obedience to the imam was a religious obligation. If the imam commanded surrender, the faithful were expected to follow. But one fortress remained different. Alamut itself, the symbolic heart of the entire movement, was slower to accept the order. Its defenders had spent generations believing their stronghold was nearly invincible. The idea that it might surrender without a fight seemed almost impossible to accept. Yet reality left them little choice. Without support from the surrounding fortresses, without an independent leader, and with Mongol forces already tightening their grip on the region, the defenders of Alamut understood that resistance could only delay the inevitable. Eventually, the order from the imam was confirmed. The gates were opened. For the first time in its 166-year history, the Eagle's Nest surrendered to an outside army. What followed was not merely the capture of a fortress. It was the collapse of an entire political system that had shaped Middle Eastern history for nearly 2 centuries. The Mongols had proven that even the most sophisticated strategy of secrecy, fear, and intelligence had limits when confronted by overwhelming power. And for the state founded by Hassanai Sebah, that moment marked the beginning of the end. The surrender of the fortress did not bring peace. In many medieval conflicts, the fall of a stronghold marked the end of a campaign. But when the Mongol war machine captured a city or fortress, surrender was often only the beginning of a much larger transformation. Their goal was not merely to win battles. It was to erase the structures of resistance so completely that no rebellion could easily rise again. That principle guided what happened next at Alamut Castle. When Hulagu Khan arrived to inspect the fortress personally, he was not dealing with an ordinary military objective. Alamut had been the heart of a political and ideological network that had influenced the Middle East for nearly 2 centuries. Leaving it intact would mean leaving behind a powerful symbol, one that could inspire future resistance. So the Mongols made a calculated decision. The fortress would not simply be occupied. It would be dismantled. The process was systematic. Mongol engineers, the same specialists who had designed the siege machines that broke the Ismaili defenses, now turned their attention to destruction. Buildings were emptied. Storehouses were opened and stripped of valuable supplies. The carefully designed structures that once supported life on the mountain were methodically dismantled. Unlike many fortresses that could be demolished quickly with brute force, Alamut had been built with remarkable engineering skill. Its walls were reinforced with layers of stone, plaster, and even lead plating in certain sections. Simply knocking them down would have taken enormous effort. Instead, the Mongols used a slower but more effective method. Fires were set inside the buildings, allowing the structures to weaken from within. Once the flames had done their work, the remaining walls and towers were torn down piece by piece. The terraces where gardens once flourished were stripped bare. The laboratories, living quarters, and defensive positions that had once made the Eagle's Nest a marvel of medieval design were reduced to ruins. Yet the physical destruction of the fortress was only part of the story. Inside Alamut had existed something even more valuable than its defensive walls: knowledge. The fortress was home to one of the most remarkable libraries in the Islamic world. Over generations, scholars working within the Ismaili community had collected and copied manuscripts covering astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and theology. Many of these works were rare. Some may have existed nowhere else. When the Mongols entered the complex, the library became one of the most tragic casualties of the conquest. Historical accounts describe shelves filled with carefully preserved manuscripts accumulated over more than a century of intellectual life. For a brief moment, there was an attempt to separate texts considered valuable from those viewed as ideological or heretical. But the majority of the collection did not survive. Fires were lit, and thousands of manuscripts were consumed in flames that burned for days. For scholars who study medieval history today, the loss remains one of the great cultural tragedies of the era. Entire schools of thought, records of scientific observations, and historical writings disappeared into smoke rising from the mountain. Beyond the fortress itself, the consequences of the Mongol victory spread rapidly across the surrounding regions. Communities that had lived for generations under the protection of the Ismaili network suddenly found themselves exposed. In several areas, Mongol commanders gathered Ismaili populations under the pretense of administrative reorganization or negotiation. Once assembled, many of these communities were massacred. The exact numbers remain debated by historians, but contemporary chroniclers describe tens of thousands of deaths in the months following the fall of Alamut. Entire villages in the valleys surrounding the fortress were emptied. Families that had lived in the region for generations were scattered, enslaved, or killed. For the Ismaili state that Hassanai Sabah had founded nearly 2 centuries earlier, the collapse was devastating. Meanwhile, the young imam who had surrendered in hopes of limiting the destruction faced a grim fate of his own. After cooperating with the Mongols and ordering the remaining fortresses to surrender, Rukn al-Din Kursha was sent eastward toward the Mongol capital to present himself before the Great Khan, Monk Khan. The journey took months, crossing vast distances through Central Asia. When Kursha finally arrived, he hoped to secure recognition or at least mercy for what remained of his followers. But the reception he received was cold and dismissive. From the Mongol perspective, the campaign had taken longer than expected, and several Ismaili fortresses had resisted longer than promised. The Great Khan saw little reason to tolerate the former ruler. Kursha was ordered to return westward, but he would never complete the journey. Somewhere along the road, far from the mountains where his ancestors had ruled, he and his small escort were executed by Mongol guards. There were no ceremonies, no final negotiations, and no witnesses beyond the soldiers who carried out the order. The last imam of the Alamut state died anonymously on a remote road, bringing an abrupt end to a political tradition that had shaped the Middle East for generations. Even after Alamut fell, a few Ismaili fortresses continued to resist. One stronghold in particular managed to hold out for years as Mongol forces maintained a long siege around it. But these final pockets of resistance were isolated. Without coordination or leadership, they eventually collapsed one by one. By the early 1260s, the entire Ismaili fortress network had effectively disappeared. And yet the Mongol campaign in the region was far from over. With the mountain strongholds eliminated, Hulagu Khan turned his attention toward a far greater prize: the ancient city of Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and one of the most important cultural and political centers in the Islamic world. In 1258, Mongol armies surrounded the city. What followed was one of the most catastrophic sackings in medieval history. The caliph was captured and executed, and large portions of the city were destroyed. Libraries, schools, and archives that had preserved centuries of scholarship were lost. Chroniclers later wrote that so many books were thrown into the Tigris River that its waters ran dark with ink. Within just a few years, the Mongol campaign had erased 2 of the most influential centers of intellectual and political life in the medieval Middle East. For the people who lived through those events, it must have felt as though an entire world had collapsed. History rarely ends as cleanly as the fall of a fortress. When the walls of Alamut Castle were torn down in the 13th century, it may have seemed as though the entire world of the Nizari Ismailis had vanished with them. Their strongholds were destroyed, their leaders scattered, and the political system built by Hassanai Sabah appeared to have been erased by the overwhelming power of the Mongol Empire. But history has a way of preserving ideas long after armies have disappeared. The Nizari Ismaili community survived. Quietly, far from the attention of conquerors, its leaders continued the line of spiritual leadership that eventually reached the modern era under figures like Aga Khan IV. Even the word assassin, now part of everyday language, still carries an echo of that distant mountain world where politics, faith, and strategy once intertwined. Today, visitors who climb the steep paths to the ruins of Alamut stand among broken stones overlooking the same valleys that once guarded one of history's most enigmatic states. The fortress is gone, but its story remains a powerful reminder. Power built on intelligence and fear can endure for generations, but history always brings forces capable of changing the game. If you enjoy exploring the dramatic turning points of history and the rise and fall of powerful civilizations, consider subscribing to the channel and joining us for the next story, because the past still has many secrets waiting to be uncovered.